So I want to welcome everybody. I think we've got some people that are still coming in. So as you come in, please put it on speaker view. Again, this is our 14th session. We're really happy to continue to do these. Tomorrow, we have Chairman Terry Canales, the chairman of the House Transportation Committee. He'll be joining us next week, next Tuesday morning at 9 a.m. We have Representative Ray Lopez, and he has introduced House Bill 207 related to the gas tax. So he will be with us. And then next Thursday at 2 p.m., we have Senator Larry Taylor joining us for another Lege and Learn. So we've got a few more after that to make announcements for, and we look forward to having you join us for those. I do want to take a minute to thank our sponsors. We have Costello Engineering, Outreach Strategists, the Lentz Group, Half Associates, LAN, LJA Engineering, and Memorial Hermann Hospital System. So thank you so much to our series sponsors. I do want to remind everybody to ask questions. Please use the chat box to message me directly with your full name, affiliation, and your question, and whether or not you want me to ask it for you or you want to ask it yourself. And so with that, I'm actually going to tip it to one of TAG's fund members, Mr. T. Wayne Holcomb, who is going to actually introduce the representative for today. So T. Wayne, do you want to take it away?
Thank you, Andrea. I really appreciate that. And I must say it is an honor to get to introduce not only State Representative Ken King, but also my friend Ken King. You know, Ken was first elected into the House of Representatives for District 88 back in 2014 by over a 90+% percentile margin. He's got an amazing district. It covers 17 counties and is almost goes across the whole panhandle diagonally, and it's like 2.5 hour drive from one corner to the other corner. It's a most amazing district I think that we have in the Texas House. You know, Ken has served on Judiciary and Civil Jurisprudence Committee as well as Education Committee. And if I had to make a guess, I would think he would be the next Education Chairman in this upcoming session. Was all the good work that he's done in the past, being a school board member with education. He's one of definitely the top leader in education when it comes to Texas. And for Ken is when he's not in the House of Representatives, he's an oil and gas man by the day, but in his spare time, an interesting fact about Ken is he raises bucking livestock, mainly bucking bulls that are featured here in the Houston Livestock Show and Rodeo, as well as PBR in Vegas and all over. He's got a lovely wife, Robin, and 2 amazing kids. I think all in all, he is one of the most approachable and one of the good guys in the Texas House, as well as the entire legislation. You may remember last session, Ken introduced a bill that didn't get through, but it was in regards to electric vehicles, putting a registration fee on electric vehicles that would help fund transportation. And so with that, I could go on for days, but Andrea said it's not the T. Wayne show, especially when it comes to talking about my friend Ken King, but I'll turn it over to him now.
Oh, well, thank you all very, very much for having me today. I guess this is actually your show, so we're going to talk about whatever you want to talk about. My background, as T. Wayne said, is largely been in education since I got in the House, but I've had the opportunity to serve on numerous committees. You don't represent 17 counties and only be able to field one subject. You have to wear a lot of hats to represent the folks I represent. One of the interesting facts about my side of the state, about 20% of the population lives west of 35, but about 80% of the food, fiber, and fuel comes from my side of the state. So I don't have a I hardly ever see a huge division, Republican versus Democrat, as much as I see rural versus urban. And, that's something that is a balancing act. We have 19 members west of 35 in the Texas House. When you think about Dallas, Houston, and San Antonio, there's half the Texas House comes from those areas. About the three cities have about 25 reps apiece. So it is a little bit of a challenge, but so far, I think it's been successful. Being a state representative has been certainly something I never set out to do. I never put state representative as a goal of mine. And just quickly, and I think maybe tells you a little bit about me, I'll tell you quickly how this happened. In 2009, I was president of my school board, and we were a property wealthy district. And those of you who understand school finance know that Texas operates a Robin Hood system where we take from the wealthy districts and we redistribute to the property poor districts. And there's certainly some inequities in that, but it's been something that's been upheld by our Supreme Court. So it is reality. But in 2009, my school district thought we were going to lose about 80% of our taxable values because natural gas declined from $7 to $9 to under $2, which is roughly where it stayed ever since. So we asked the legislature to allow us to do basically a tax swap. We wanted to drop below the compressed rate for 1 year, and what we were going to do is, instead of paying our Robin Hood payment, we were going to pay our bond debt off early. We were told we were fiscal conservatives and way to go by the governor, the speaker at the time, the lieutenant governor, TEA. So we do this, and 10 months after the fact, we were informed by the Texas Education Agency we violated a 1993 law that they didn't know about, and we owed $4 million that we didn't tax for. So going into the 11th session, I spent that time as my own time, my own money, trying to basically get people like me to talk to me and understand my story and what happened. And obviously that didn't happen. And that was a session. Public education was cut $5.5 billion. So I remember standing in my predecessor's office at the time with another school board member friend of mine. And I told him, I said, listen, I don't even know where the bathroom is in this place. I've been in the Capitol one time before this happened. And I said, but one thing I do know, if one of us doesn't have a seat out there, we're never getting that money back. And I drew the short straw. So I ran for the legislature. I won. I was successful in getting the $4 million back from my school district within my first session. But one thing I learned is about 75% of the budget, no matter how big the budget is, goes to public education. An educated workforce is our greatest natural resource. And I started looking around. The public ed committee had no rural members on it. There was nobody advocating for our kids. And so I would suggest to you that any of your elected officials, if they ever tell you, particularly here in Texas, that education's not their thing, or that's just not something they engage in, that's like you being an employer saying you don't care about your labor costs. That's where we spend all the money. and it certainly, like I say, is our greatest natural resource, our children. So that was kind of my pathway to the legislature, and my reasoning for staying on the public education committee as long as I have. Since I've been in the legislature, I've served on state affairs, the calendars committee, civil jurisprudence, environmental reg. I currently am a member of the licensing committee. So we do wear a lot of hats, and we work on a lot of different stuff. But when you hear people talk about my role in education, now you know why.
Thank you for sharing that. I think that's a very valid point that we often don't think about as, maybe we don't think of education as an issue that all of us are thinking about all the time, but it does consume a large portion of the budget. So it impacts many other things. The other thing I want to follow up on is looking at some of the issues that are going to bubble to the surface for the upcoming session. We know that education will be obviously one of the main issues. We also are hearing that, it looks like you all may gavel in and then kind of recess just to focus on the budget. What is your sense for how issues are going to be dealt with in the first 30 days as we look towards session?
Well, I think it's going to look different than anything I've ever seen or anybody else in living memory. I think we go in and we will swear in and we will certainly address the House rules. Regardless, we have to do that before we can do anything else. I think we will certainly adopt a budget on time, but I don't think we gavel in and gavel out and just leave. I just don't think we do. And largely, I don't think we do that because I think there's some constitutional issues with that.
Right.
I'm not sure we can, number one. But more than anything else, we have not spent any time on interim studies. And it's something we're supposed to be a part-time legislature, which isn't true. I mean, you serve 1 year, the next year you run and you serve on multiple committees and you get all the legwork done before session because I think a lot of folks maybe on this call don't even know the legislature is a big old clock. We have 140 days every 2 years to do something 2 year for you. And when the 150 House members, 31 senators, 140 days, particularly when you don't hear bills on the House floor for the first 60 days, isn't a lot of time in a normal year.
Right.
Well, so really what I suspect is there'll probably be the same number of bills filed. I think maybe half the bills that normally get a hearing actually get a hearing. I think we're going to prioritize some things that have to be done. Talking about education, House Bill 3, there's some things that have to be done to protect what we did last time when we put $11.5 billion into public ed. On transportation and our infrastructure, broadband and particularly rural connectivity is going to have a place at the center of the table this time. So I think we're going to see some priorities happen. I think there will be some limited contact. I think you'll be limited on how many people can be in an office at one time. I think committee hearings and committee space is going to be limited. So, if this is a session where we don't take any steps backwards, but we maintain and protect what we've done in the last 2 sessions, I think we're all a winner. I'm a guy that is always for less government. And so that, the less bills that get passed is typically better for everybody. Normally we see about 6,000 bills drafted in a session, somewhere between 6 and 7. And I don't think anybody believes there's 7,000 good ideas in Austin, Texas. So the less bills we have make it to the floor, I think Texas wins overall. We're gonna have a very difficult session for a number of reasons. We're late. We don't have a lot of the legwork done. The comptroller did come out and say we're going to have more money than he first thought, right. Which is actually pretty exciting to me. I'm a little bit shocked by that. I'm anxious to see his report and see where how his Aggie math is working out. But I think if we don't have a deficit budget, that helps. I think the pandemic and being short on time is going to dictate the budget. And if we don't do anything to hurt anybody, Texas wins.
So thank you for that overview. I think also, not only are we coming into a session where there's a lot of change, but we're also coming into a session with a new speaker. So from your lens, can you share how the personality of our prospective new speaker will shape those conversations and where you feel that will influence things like committee assignments and how quickly things get done and just kind of the tone and personality of the session?
Well, I think anybody who wanted to be speaker in 2021, all I can say is bless their heart. I mean, it's going to be the worst session ever to try to be the speaker, and largely because of this pandemic. I think the fact that the comptroller came out and said we are going to have more money than he first thought we were going to have is going to ease that burden some money in this when you're doing this job fixes a lot of problems. So but as far as Speaker-elect Phelan, he is he lives about as far away from me as humanly possible. In both of us still being in the state of Texas, we certainly have different priorities and different issues come to the front. But Dade is a super smart guy. And even though Beaumont isn't really considered a rural area, the rest of his district certainly is. So we do share a lot of similarities and values. And frankly, our people are kind of the same people. When you get outside of the big city, there's three things that the folks want to talk about. It's water, education, transportation. And that's what's going to brings all Texans together, regardless of party. Those are the three subjects everybody believes that the state government should have a role in. And I think Speaker-elect Phelan is right in there on that. As far as committee assignments and those kind of things go, under the Joe Strauss regime, I was fortunate from my very first session to frankly get to play a leadership role. And, the last session, Speaker Strauss was in power. I served on 5 committees, including calendars, state affairs, and public education. So, while I have, I've chaired subcommittees and different things. While I haven't had a full chairmanship yet, I've certainly been in a leadership role. And last session, I've frankly got busted because I never supported the incoming speaker, and I ended up with public education and the licensing committee. And what I learned from that, all of this worry that we all get, and anxiety and angst about are you going to get to be a chairman, or what committee are you going to be on, or those kind of things. When I was in leadership, I was able to shoot and score. And when I was on the bench, I was able to shoot and score. I think it has to do with your relationships and who your friends are and what your priority are in the session. So I've lost 0 sleep over where I'm going to end up under a Phelan administration. I am excited for him, and I'm excited to have him as a speaker because, like I say, he's super smart and he's a good friend.
Well, that's helpful. Thank you. I do want to go back and you mentioned the rural versus urban conversation, and our chairman Mustafa Tamiz is on and has talked about that previously in a lot of our conversations. So Mustafa, I'm going to tip it to you.
Thank you. Representative, thank you so much for being with us today. One thing that is really important for us and our membership for representative like you to know that we represent a lot of the rural parts of Texas, because a lot of the counties that are around our area and our members, we have half a dozen counties around our jurisdiction that are members of TAG. So we talk a lot about those and making sure that we help bridge that divide, especially when it comes to transportation issues. And we think transportation is the kind of thing where we can build that consensus between the urban and rural, because the road that starts there ends up in the urban area a lot of times, right? So that bottleneck can happen at any of those points that we want to alleviate. So one thing we wanted to point out to you and others as you think about this, for every dollar that's invested in transportation, you get anywhere between $3 to $6 in economic activity. So as you go into this next session, there'll be a lot of tough decisions that are made. Some of them will be about cutting, even though we have more revenue, right? And some of them might be about putting projects in the future in a biennial budget rather than in next year. And we think transportation, if it's pushed off to the future, you're also pushing off the economic recovery for both rural and urban areas. And so we wanted to give you that, because especially when it comes to education, sometimes people say it's education over other things. And when it comes to transportation, we don't believe that. We think that transportation what drives the revenue in the state, which helps education, including our gas tax.
Okay. Well, I don't disagree with anything you said. I didn't necessarily hear a question as much as a statement, but I don't disagree with what you're saying there. And listen, I certainly support transportation and always have, and will continue to do so. I think when I say the divide in rural versus urban, it's not so much that my urban colleagues support transportation and I don't, or vice versa.
Yeah.
It's more about on the billions of dollars we spend on transportation, do my farm to market roads get fixed, or do we build another overpass in Houston? That's the rural versus urban divide. Not that you don't need another overpass in Houston, but if I don't have roads, I can't get the 80% of the food, fiber, and fuel that my constituents create to Houston. So when I'm talking about the division of rural versus urban, I don't think there's any debate on that transportation is at least as equally as important as our education funding, as much as how are those dollars divided and spread out around the state. And that's a regional thing for who puts you in office.
Right. And the thing, I guess, more than the question, I guess the thing I want you to know about us, although Houston is in our name, we represent a lot of the rural counties.
That's
So
great.
sometimes, yeah. So sometimes, for example, as I mentioned, we have half a dozen counties that are rural counties and suburban counties that are part of our coalition. And so count on us to help you in some of those types of conversations, because we're an advocate for transportation, not just sort of urban versus rural, even though you've got Houston in our name.
Sure.
Thank you, Mustafa. No, excellent points. I think, in addition to the economic development numbers, right, are spun in that are the job numbers that are really critical that come with investing in transportation. And so I think it's a great segue to talk about the gas tax. We could spend an hour talking about all the iterations of the gas tax legislation that's been introduced and not made it through very far, and for there's different reasons. We know that there's not been an increase or an index since the 90s. Some feel an index is an increase. Some don't. So there's been some legislation introduced already for this session. Through your lens, Representative King, can you share your thoughts on the gas tax and whether or not you think that's a viable thing to look at this session, at least indexing it, knowing that there is a portion that provides funding for education in that?
Right. Listen, I spent all of 2018 serving on the School Finance Commission, which is what ultimately created House Bill 3. And more than that, I spent that entire year on the subcommittee discussing revenue. And I'm somebody that, the only constitutional check we write in Texas is public education. Article 7 of the Constitution says Texas will provide free public education. That's the only thing we're required to do in 140 days besides pass a balanced budget. So my opinion is if that's our constitutional obligation, and if we don't pay for anything else, we're going to pay for public ed. We should not pass laws to increase spending and then not pay for it. So I've looked at every revenue idea I can think of, or anybody else can think of, for a lot of years now, particularly in 2018. Indexing the gas tax, to me, number one, isn't the revenue producer it used to be. Back in the 90s, when the last time it was increased, we didn't have as many cars, but they got about half as many miles a gallon. So it was, and if you look at a gallon of gas today, between the federal and the state tax, that's where the cost of the gallon of gas is. It's not the gasoline. The other thing I would say about that is adding another tax onto fossil fuels is the definition of insanity. It's doing the same thing over and over, expecting a different result. In the 90s, according, if you go back and look at comptroller reports, oil and gas production in the state of Texas was about 38% of our GSP. It's around 9% today. So continue to tax the fossil fuel business to pay for roads and schools and everything else that we do in the state, and not look at other revenue alternatives, I think is frankly sticking our head in the sand and not looking at the realities. In the 90s, when this revenue stream was created, we had about 10 million Texans. Today, we have 30 million Texans. We have 5.5 million kids in our schools. Our roads are getting used a lot more than they were in the 90s. Trucks are heavier, whatever you want to talk about. And the fact that most of the roads, when you get outside of the newer construction in the interstate system, have no sub bases under them. So when you put a 90,000 pound trucks on them, and I don't care if they're carrying milk or oil or that asphalt doesn't know what that truck's carrying. Those roads without sub bases are going to continue to deteriorate. But to think that an index on the gasoline tax would create enough revenue to even make a difference, I don't think the folks that are advocating that have actually done the math. I think we have to look for other revenue ideas in a state where we don't have a statewide property tax, unless you contribute to a property wealthy school district, and some people might argue that. And I don't think, at least as long as I'm in office, or probably the rest of my life, I don't think Texas will vote for an income tax. So, we have to start looking for a way to fund the increasing population and building up our infrastructure. And it can't always be another fossil fuel tax.
Right. No, and I think I agree with that. I think one of the, some of the conversations we've had, I know Vice Chairman Kelly Hancock in the Senate Transportation Committee spoke very similarly when we talked to him about, we were actually having a conversation about alternatively fueled vehicles, right? And how do we capture their usage of our infrastructure without them currently paying into the gas tax, right? And his comment was that we need to look at the entire funding structure itself, because pieces of it are considered archaic, right? Because we're moving away from a fossil fuel primary source for moving our vehicles. We're moving towards technology and electric and alternatively fueled. So it's a great segue for your bill that you've introduced, House Bill 427. And this bill, it's your bill, so I'm gonna let you talk about it a little bit, but essentially it does address this issue that we're facing, where electric vehicles are not paying into a gas tax, and we're only going to increase the electric vehicle population on the roads, right? Some would argue that the numbers aren't high enough, right? The revenue numbers aren't there yet. And to counter that, we would say, well, yes, but they are increasing, and we know that that is where we're walking towards, not away from, like we are from fossil fuels. So with that, I'm going to let you talk a little bit about House Bill 427 and perhaps, why you introduced it and what are some of the things that you think it can do for funding transportation.
Well, so the bill essentially would put a registration fee annually on electric cars of $200 and hybrid cars of $100, because they don't pay into the gas tax. I've been told last session when I introduced the bill that my numbers are too high. Well, the numbers come from a combined number from the federal DMV and the state DMV. And the bill matches up with bills that have already been passed in other states. Alabama passed one that goes into effect this coming year in 21, and their numbers are exactly what my bill calls for. I have found out there was a couple differences in the Alabama law. A percentage of the fee goes to putting charging stations in around the state of Alabama, and then it has a provision that would lessen the fee depending on what the federal government does. So we wouldn't be double taxing. If the feds decide to tax in a different way, then the state fee would come down. It's how the Alabama law works. We haven't necessarily got that far. I guess to answer your question, on the amount of money it would gross right. Obviously, it's not a drop in the bucket compared to the gas tax, because we don't have that many of them, but we have more than we had last session. And I'm sorry, I don't have my stat sheet, so I hate to get into specific numbers but hundreds of thousands of these cars are being introduced to our Texas highways every year, plus the people that drive through our state with them. And as I said before we went into this, everybody wants schools and roads and hospitals and all of this stuff, but the opponents of this bill just don't want to pay for it. They want all this stuff, but they want somebody else's industry to pay for it. This has my introduction of this bill really doesn't have anything to do with supporting the internal combustion engine as much as it does when these things take over. If there's nothing in place to make up for that lost revenue, we're going to be in trouble. It's, you know, I always bring up the old adage of the best time to plant a tree. You know, the best time to plant a tree is 20 years ago. The next best time's today.
Right.
And better get to planting trees, because renewables and electric cars and are not a novelty. They're not something that are going away. They're going to be mainstream probably sooner than a lot of us maybe would like. So, you know, we certainly need to prepare the way for when that takes over. You know, I would suspect the buggy maker paid a hell of a lot more taxes than the automaker did at one time.
Right. Well, so I think then the question too is, when we talk about electric vehicles and traditionally fueled vehicles, how, you know, the VMT conversation kind of is in the back of my mind too. So there's been, you know, opponents of something like this would say, well, shouldn't we just move to a VMT model, because otherwise now we've got kind of these different pieces and we're assessing an annual registration fee. We don't really know how much they're really using. We're trying to guess, right? We're trying to ballpark what they would be paying into the gas tax annually if they were fueling their car with gas. So how do you navigate that conversation for those folks that would talk about what would want to move to more of a VMT conversation for funding transportation?
Well, and you know, I think as far as like a registration fee, you know, we based our numbers based on the average miles driven in the United States and in Texas, which is around 13,000 miles a year for the average motorist. Like I say, the number that I introduced takes into account the federal gas tax as well as the state gas tax, and I'm certainly willing to when the feds address the issue to reduce what the state would gather from that, and I'm willing to entertain any number that's based on fact. The reason I haven't changed the number from last session to this session is I've had nobody that was an opponent of the bill actually bring me a factual number. It's like, oh yeah, we think we ought to pay something, just not that much. Okay, well, how much is the right number? Well, we don't know. We really don't want to pay anything. You know, we want everybody else to pay it but us. And you know, and here's the other thing that I find that you didn't ask this, but I'll tell you anyway. The average cost of one of these electric cars is about $58,000. So when the opponents talk about, I mean, they like to bring up that they try to turn this into like a poor man tax and that kind of thing. The people that are driving these things are the top earners in our state and our nation. You know, it's just ridiculous that they think they should get to use our infrastructure and not pay something in. I've never filed a bill that I passed that looked the way it did at the end, as it started in January.
Right.
So I suspect there's going to be a lot of negotiation. I think there's going to be a lot of push and pull and give and take. I don't think House Bill 427 will pass in its current form, but we're going to continue to push. And we're going to continue to, and largely we're going to push because it's time to have these conversations. You know, we're going into 2021, and as we've already talked about, we're on the same revenue stream we were in the 90s. Things look a heck of a lot different than they did in the 90s.
Right. No, agreed. And we appreciate you continuing the conversation. You know, we supported a bill that was similar, introduced by Representative Mondo Martinez, but it transferred the money back to the counties, right, that were collecting the registration fees. It looks a little bit different, right? And so I think you're spot on when you say it's not going to look the same as it does right now, because the devil's in the details, and there's a lot of negotiation that needs to happen for people to feel comfortable. I think everybody can agree that something needs to be done, but it's the how and the why and the what. So, but we really appreciate that that you're keeping this conversation, and we will stay very close to this piece of legislation. We'll work with you if there's a co-sponsor opportunities. We've talked with a lot of other legislators already, kind of keying them into this bill to pay attention and to be part of those conversations. So we really appreciate the work that you're doing for it. I want to switch a little bit. I know that you have to pop out about 10 of, so I'm mindful of that, but I don't want to finish this without talking about safety, because it's very much associated with transportation. And Jay Crosley with Farm City gave has a great question. He says, one of the issues where we don't have as much rural and urban divide is transportation safety, with traffic crashes, really devastating families in West Texas at high rates, sometimes just as high as some of the urban areas as Houston. A significant portion of TxDOT's budget is increased for road to zero safety funding to address these high rate and these high fatality rates. Can you share with us where your priorities are for supporting kind of these traffic safety initiatives as we march towards the session? I know that there's already been some bills that have been introduced related to speed limit reductions, pedestrian safety, bicyclist safety, things like that. So can you talk about, from your vantage point, transportation safety policies that you are looking to support in the upcoming session?
Well, I'm not familiar with any specific bills that have been filed to address this. I can tell you, in my district, and like I say, it's very rural. It's most of these towns are really small. Where we struggle the most is TxDOT policy and rules on, say, a traffic light or a reduction in a speed limit or a crosswalk. Because, I'll give you a great example. Highway 207 runs into Highway 287. Well, 287, runs Amarillo to Wichita Falls and into Fort Worth. It's a very highly traveled road, lots of truck traffic. And, as our brick and mortar retail spaces continue to count for less, that's one thing that we are going to see is more trucks. More people are buying from home and those kind of things. So trucks are definitely an issue. But in this particular case, this highway goes right through Claude, Texas. Most of you probably have never heard of Claude, Texas, but it's in Armstrong County, and it was roughly the home of Charles Goodnight, who started the first ranch in the Panhandle. If you ever want to see the actual buffalo herd, you can go up there and go to Caprock Canyons. Charles and Molly Goodnight saved the buffalo, or we would not have any American bison. Sorry. That was a little side note about my district. That's where they all live. But the problem with 207 and 287 is trucks come through this little town. This little town is big enough to have a sheriff and a deputy. There's no law enforcement there. The trucks hit that town, even though the speed limit drops to 40 miles an hour, they're still hitting 70 going by the courthouse. 207 is a huge farm to market road, particularly cotton farmers. You can imagine a cotton truck carrying round bales or a module bale trying to get across 287 at any time of the day. And so here's the issue. According to TxDOT, 287 certainly meets traffic requirements for a stoplight going through Claude, Texas, but 207 doesn't. So the ratio doesn't mean, so my point is, when I look at safety issues, it's frustrating to me because it's just like a lot of other things we do in state government. We tend to create one size fits all policies instead of looking at the specific situation and the safety of that situation, not what some computer matrix spit out. So those are really the kind of issues I'm engaging in right now as far as safety and TxDOT policy going forward. I don't necessarily think that somebody in Austin that typed a bunch of numbers in a computer actually knows what the hell's going on at 287 and 207 in Claude, Texas. I am extremely excited though that our West Texas Commissioner New, when I reached out to him on this issue, made a personal trip up there and drove across that intersection himself. And I think that's a heck of a place to start.
Right. I think, some of the issues are, you know, that I appreciate you illustrating that, because I think it is, especially right now, we're having a hard time connecting and traveling and moving about as we normally would, to illustrate how it's not a one size fits all, right? I think for some of the legislation, I think Representative Celia Israel has introduced, there's at least one bill that she's introduced related to reducing speed limits. And it's more in kind of areas where, you know, it's a residential or area and the speed limit's 35 and just reducing it to 25 is the difference between an injury and a fatality for somebody in a car accident. So I think it does bring about the topic of the local versus state control conversations too, right? Giving the localities more flexibility and ability to do things that they know are helpful for their particular area versus a statewide mandate that is absolutely a one size fits all. And so there are some localities that really are struggling with this and would really appreciate, you know, having kind of this more standard approach to reduction in speed limits. And there's a lot of other things that go to the Road to Zero funding, but I think in general, we're very conscious of the fact that it's a safety issue, and it's quite frankly, it's a monetary issue too, because these crashes and I mean, all of that adds to money and budgets too, you know, out of our transportation pot. So we really appreciate you sharing your perspective on that. I'm mindful of the time, so I'm going to ask one more question. When we look at the session and we talk about finding new ways for revenue for transportation, we talk about the electric vehicle fee. We talked about the gas tax. In your mind, when we frame these conversations in the local versus state kind of arena, what is the appetite for allowing local governments to be able to either tax themselves or assess fees that are helpful for funding local projects? So it's a constant push and pull at the state level. COVID has, I would say, added to that a little bit with some of the emergency orders that coming from the state versus the counties. Your perspective on kind of the appetite for conversation around some of these local control conversations. I'm going to throw out an example, right? People get real nervous when I say this, but I'm just going to put it out there. Talk about the sales tax and how we're capped, right? We don't even have the ability locally to tax ourselves to do fund transportation, fund specific projects that we would want to be able to take care of ourselves and not have to rely on the state. And we don't have the ability to do that. There's a lot of other issues that fall under that local versus state control conversation, but it is a constant fight, it feels, between local officials and state officials on this and other policies related to just being able to tax ourselves. So your thoughts on that? You know, not issuing a state mandate, but just having that enabling legislation to provide that flexibility.
Well, let's talk quickly about sales tax, you know, and I know we're talking about transportation, but when we were looking at revenue on how to fund schools, you know, 66% of our general revenue comes from sales tax in the state of Texas. The easiest way to fund public schools and meet our constitutional obligation, which is the state pays 51% of the cost of education, which would also enormously buy down local property taxes if the state was paying for that. The easiest way to do that is an increase in sales tax. I mean, that's the one thing Texas can do under our current constitution that would generate more revenue than anything else. When we proposed that during the School Finance Commission, it was, we were told that the governor would veto any effort to expand sales tax, whether we were expanding what we tax or whether we were expanding how much we tax, that it would get a veto. Well, you know, last session was all about capping local governments and local property taxes, and you know, the 2.5% and then the 3.5% on counties, municipalities, and schools, and then at some point in time, some of those that have a higher pay grade than myself figured out that caps cost money. You know, we can cap local governments as a state. We can cap it at anything we want to. Cap it at 1% or 0% growth. well, then the state's portion's going up, you know? And so then all of a sudden it was, oh my God, we got to raise sales tax. Well, the problem with the way that was presented to the folks is, okay, we're going to raise sales tax a penny, but you know, 5% is going here, 10% is going there, you know, and frankly, I can tell you the people I represent smelled the bullshit way off. And you know, if you want to talk about raising sales tax and you want the support of the Texas voter, I think you have to be very transparent and very open about what are you going to do with the money.
Right.
And if we're going to fund highways, fine. If we're going to fund schools, fine. But we have to make the case that this is what it's going to do, and this is what you're going to get in return. You know, we're going to fund our public schools with a cent raise on sales tax, but by the way, it'll buy your local property tax down somewhere around 5%. You know, and present it that way. Then I think you get the support of the people. As far as allowing cities to set their own sales tax rate and those kind of things, I think, regardless of my opinion, I think we're a heck of a long ways off. Hell, we were just capping you last time. I mean, you know, I think we got to quit capping you before we can trust you to govern yourselves. I'm a local control guy, but I came from local government. And, you know, every 2 years, I remember sitting in board meetings, whether I was president of my local appraisal board or president of my school board or whatever else I was on. And, you know, I said it earlier, you know, the legislature has 140 days every 2 years to do something to you or for you. When I was in local government, I've always felt like it got done to me. Right. And so I guess without answering your question, because, well, frankly, I just don't think it's something that's going to be a reality. What I would like to see happen is that we get off trying to cap the local folks. You know, I always tell my county judges, if your taxes are too high, these people need to unelect you, not me. But unfortunately, when we do cap, and that there again, it becomes a one size fits all. I don't represent a county that had ever raised their taxes 8% a year, which was the old law of the land. They hadn't raised their taxes 8% in 20 years. You know, these little rural counties that don't have any money got caught up in the same crap as Dallas, Houston, San Antonio, and Austin. And you know, I don't necessarily think caps were right for our big cities either, but I can tell you those that have been offended on tax rates, that's where it came from. You know, I voted with 33 Republicans against the taxpayer-funded lobby bill. You know, I don't think I should have to have 17 county judges in my office every day of session because they can't join TAC. I think it's ridiculous. So, you know, I'm all about local control and local government, and I think if you're in local government and you're not doing a good job and you're not a good steward of tax dollars, then the people that live in that county or city that are of voting age have a responsibility to kick your ass out. And certain things shouldn't be left to the legislature.
Right. No, I appreciate that. And I think, you know, there aren't many, it's been shared that there's the sentiment that there aren't many serving at the state level that have truly served at a local level, like you're talking about, where they can understand what that feels like.
Well, there's not only that, but you know, when you look at the makeup of the Texas House, I haven't run the numbers lately, but at one time there was 54 attorneys in the Texas House. Oh my God! You know, do we really need 54 attorneys in the Texas House? You know, and another thing, you know, I think it maybe sets me apart a little bit because I have run a business, but I've also worked by the hour. You know, and you talk about transportation and safety. You know, I'm the only member of the Texas legislature that has a CDL driver's license. I'm the only truck driver in the whole place. Now, you know, there's 54 attorneys and one truck driver. I think there's something wrong with that. But yeah, unfortunately, common sense is in short supply in the pretty pink building.
Okay. Thank you for, well, I'm adding that. I wrote that down because when we do a transportation trivia night, I'm going to say, who is the one member that has their CDL? we like those interesting facts. So, yeah, but I appreciate that because it does, it helps us understand the perspective, at the state level and what's missing and what's maybe overcompensated in many of the conversations that are happening about policy. So thank you for that. I am mindful of the time. And so I appreciate that you were able to spend as much time with us as you did today. We look forward to continued conversations with you and your staff as session starts and what that looks like. We do have our traditional advocacy day at the end of February. I'm not sure what it's going to look like, but we'll certainly be talking to your office and seeing how we can engage you either virtually or in person, whatever that needs to look like. And we'll continue to have close conversations about House Bill 427 and any other way that we can support your work. So thank you so much. Thank you again also to T. Wayne, who's one of your biggest fans. I don't know if that's a good thing or a bad thing for you, but it's a true fact. So we appreciate T. Wayne's support and making sure we had this conversation today with you. So
you bet. Well, thanks, T. Wayne. Thanks, Andrea. Glad to be on. I appreciate everybody that got on the call. And one thing, and I think T. Wayne will tell you this, I'm pretty transparent. What you see is what you get with me, and you don't have to live in my district to come in my office and ask a question.
we appreciate that. Thank you.
You bet.